Newport News, Virginia is where they build our aircraft carriers. To construct just one of them costs several years and many billions of dollars. Even some of our government's most enthusiastic warhawks openly wonder why we build them. Once in a while we'll wage a pretend war and daydream what full-scale conflict would be like, but we don't always like what we find. In 2002, around the time this story begins, the US military conducted an exercise that simulated war with an Iran-like military. It ended with, well, we got our asses kicked, folks, no two ways about it. They sunk America's armada, including one of our beloved aircraft carriers, in 10 minutes' time. Hopefully, someone learned something. The days of the average American knowing what our military does all day, much less taking pride in it, are gone. There's a reason the line goes support the troops. It's an easy sell because many of us have friends and loved ones who are in the military, but as an institution, well, there's a reason why the military spent so many years paying the NFL millions of dollars to let them perform flyovers before games. It seems as though our armed forces want just a little taste of the admiration we feel toward our athletes. Who's your favorite active military leader? What's the most recent military engagement you could get behind? Alright, here's an easier question. Who's your 22nd favorite active quarterback? You're absolutely right, it's Derek Carr. Whether you like this or think it's a good thing is an entirely separate question, but there's no two ways about it. The way we're supposed to feel about the military is the way we actually feel about our athletes. They're the heroes, the stewards of our hopes and dreams, the tactical geniuses, the builders of dynasties, the field generals, the conquerors, the ones who actually represent our ambitions and capture our imaginations. It's hard to miss the poetry of this. In the 1990s, around the time the $4.5 billion Nimitz-class Harry S. Truman was being laid down here, so many of those great American generals were rising through the ranks just on the other side of the highway, often scraping to get by financially. There was, of course, Bethel High School quarterback Allen Iverson, a transcendent football player who could seemingly do anything on the field he felt like doing. With a talent in town this radiant, it was tough to stand out if you were a kid like Aaron Brooks, who lived in the rough Ridley Circle neighborhood right near the shipyard. He played at Ferguson, a high school that was a few years away from closing down. Aaron would have a great game, throwing for 3 touchdown passes, only to lose in the shadow of Iverson, who was basically a one-man offense. Aaron was named quarterback of the All-District team, only for Iverson, who somehow also played defense just for the hell of it, to make the All-District team at defensive back. Alright, fine, let's switch to another sport. Aaron made the second All-District team in basketball, but, of course, there's Iverson, who made the first team. Turned out, Allen Iverson was good at basketball too. But Aaron kept at it, earned some attention, and eventually accepted a scholarship from the University of Virginia. He was a third-string bench warmer at first, but the fact remained, he'd made it. All the while, he had a younger cousin who watched intently. His cousin grew up a block away from Aaron, and a lot of the time you could find him fishing over at the pier a little up the road. This was a kid who listened more than he talked, who teachers described as a dream student, who tried to learn something, anything, any chance he could get. And when he was in 7th grade, he walked up to Aaron's coach, local legend Tommy Riemann, and told him he wanted to be just as good as Aaron.
After blossoming into a superstar in high school under Riemann, Michael Vick decided to stay close to home and attend Virginia Tech. Now, to say there had never been a quarterback as athletically gifted as Vick would be like saying a Beyoncé concert sounds more fun than a Gilbert Gottfried concert. It wasn't even fair to say Vick could move like a running back. In the history of organized football, nay, the history of the Milky Way galaxy, very few folks have had speed and elusiveness like his, which he combined with effortless, superhuman arm strength. It was a combination that created some pretty enormous expectations, and he met them. In 1999, by the time his college career was just 23 minutes old, the teenage Vick had already completed a 60-yard pass and scored 3 rushing touchdowns, including a 54-yarder and one that even better foreshadowed just how dynamic a force he'd become. In leading his Hokies to an undefeated regular season, Vick had 4 rushing touchdowns of over 45 yards, like this option at Pitt, where he goes from trapped in a phone booth to tearing through open field in the blink of an eye. Or this 75-yarder at Temple, where even while weaving back and forth, he makes every defender look like they're running in sand. As for the rocket launcher attached to his left shoulder, Vick was able to attack defenses downfield with deep passes that couldn't have been more accurately delivered had he walked up to his receiver and handed him the ball for an easy stroll into the end zone. He also had the touch to toss feathery soft rainbows that'd drop right in the bucket. So he wasn't just all legs. With his arm, Vic became the first Division I freshman to lead the nation in passing efficiency. That all led to a berth in the BCS National Championship game and a trip to New York as the first ever freshman quarterback Heisman finalist. The next year in Y2K, Tech won all 10 of his starts, including one in Chestnut Hill that he clinched on a 3rd and 12 when he found time to play a game of hopscotch, then another game of hopscotch, then had not one, not two, but 3 guys hopelessly dive somewhere in a neighboring zip code, then for good measure just toyed with the cornerback for the final 15 yards. He pretty much was the Matrix dude. Following his brilliant sophomore season, Vic decided to enter the 2001 NFL Draft. The presumptive top overall pick to the Chargers, who were coming off a 1-15 season and had just endured the full Ryan Leaf experience, Vic saw his pre-draft contract negotiations with them hit some major obstacles. While his agents had the audacity to expect the first overall pick to be paid like the first overall pick, because the Chargers planned to sit him for a while behind new starter Doug Flutie, they wanted to pay him less. All of a sudden, Vic to San Diego wasn't such a foregone conclusion. That was enough for the Falcons, who held the 5th overall selection, to send out some feelers regarding the viability of trading up to number 1 for the right to draft Vic. Chargers GM John Butler's initial demand for the pick was each of Atlanta's top 3 selections along with role player Tim Dwight. After extensive haggling the day before the draft, the 2 teams agreed to a deal with basically those terms, only Atlanta was able to defer shipping the 2nd round pick by a year. About 24 hours later, the Falcons officially had a new face of the franchise. Vic was eased into year 1 in the NFL as a backup to Chris Chandler, but heading into year 2, he was elevated to full-time starter, and he provided an immediate spark to a dormant offense. Their defense, under new coordinator Wade Phillips, was also massively improved. Spearheaded by rising stars at both linebacker with perennial Pro Bowler Keith Brooking, and up front with defensive end Patrick Kearney, the Falcons entered Week 8, Saints Week, having allowed the 2nd fewest points per game in the league. This was a team ready to make some noise again.
Of course, Vic was a phenomenal quarterback, but it was as if he was somehow destined to be the savior of the Falcons franchise. Here's an extremely talented black quarterback leading a hopeless franchise representing a predominantly black city. It just made sense. He single-handedly made the entire city believers again when it looked like we were done dreaming. But as a young black boy in Atlanta, watching Vic pull off unthinkable moves every week was especially surreal because he was one of us. Vic was someone I could look to and just marvel at, simply because he looked like me. And I know I wasn't alone. I've never experienced a single player capture the hearts of an entire city the way Vic did. He made people that didn't even care about football tune in every Sunday just to see him put on a show. Vic jerseys flooded the streets. He was the main topic of every conversation no matter where you were. Whether it was getting a haircut at the barbershop, picking up a 10-piece wing meal, hanging at Piedmont Park, whatever. People were either talking about what he did in last week's game or anticipating who he would make look foolish the coming week. Not only did Vic birth a new generation of Falcons fans, but he made people who were on the edge of giving up do a complete 180 and proudly rep Atlanta as the hometown team. I mean, the dude was just special.
Falcons fans attached all their hopes and dreams to Michael Vick. Big plays, playoff appearances, Super Bowl wins, but job one, just 7 games into his NFL career, was to march into the Superdome and whoop the Saints. After spending most of the 90s losing, the Saints were recently led back into contention by a 4th-round quarterback who seemed destined for life as a backup. When an injury pressed this quarterback into action, he led the Saints into the playoffs. The Saints finally have a franchise quarterback, someone who can go toe-to-toe with Michael Vick in the years to come. And look who it is. The two cousins from Ridley Circle had taken very different avenues, only to meet right in the middle of the most intense rivalry in professional American sports. While Vic had become a national megastar before he was even drafted, Aaron Brooks was far less heralded. And while he could create space with his mobility, he was far more of a conventional quarterback. Which is why, after seeing a gap on the Saints' opening drive and picking up a big chunk of easy yards, he gives himself up with the nearest defender 5 yards away. Looks a little silly, but it's smart. He's the most valuable player on the team. Why risk your health for the sake of 5 yards in one drive of one game? This is what most quarterbacks would do. And this is what Vic does a couple of drives later. Like the Brooks play, this is not a designed run, but he senses an opportunity. Now here he is, 19 yards upfield, right where his cousin hit the deck. Most would taper off to the sideline and step out of bounds, especially with the defender right ahead of him. But he cuts in. His reward is probably 1 extra yard. Getting hit just doesn't concern him that much. On the final play of this drive, they do call a design quarterback run, with Vic immediately rolling right to follow his blockers. There have always been mobile quarterbacks, but this felt new. Saints linebacker Cedric Hodge is taking a line that would have made sense for any of them. But Vic has seen tacklers cut in too sharp his entire life, from Newport News to Blacksburg to the NFL. He's just too quick. He's a master at turning no space into enough space. After an ensuing Saints fumble, it's a great time to meet Alge Crumpler. At tight end, Crumpler was Vic's favorite target in these early years, accounting for about a quarter of all receiving yards. That old red gun offense that had no use for a tight end was completely a thing of the past. But Crumpler did pick up a torch once carried by Ironhead Hayward, that of a highly athletic ball carrier who is also absolutely enormous. Alge Crumpler was listed at 6'2", 275 pounds. Body mass index isn't all that useful for a lot of things, but it does help us appreciate how majestically large this man is. Over to the left, you see some really big and tall dudes, tight ends like Antonio Gates and Rob Gronkowski, who hauled in massive receiving yards. Over here we have Ironhead, who racked up about 1,500 receiving yards on the side. But nobody in NFL history this massive has ever accounted for anywhere near this many yards to the air. A lot of his yards came after the catch. Allow Saints defender Jay Bellamy to demonstrate. Vic finds Crumpler for what seems at first like a little dump off when Bellamy throws every last one of his 200 pounds at him. This is not a missed tackle, it's not a bad tackle, there just is not enough Jay Bellamy. Crumpler absorbs the full blow, sheds him completely, stays in bounds, and keeps on trucking for more than 30 yards. This drive ends with another touchdown for Atlanta. Like Falcons-Saints contests usually are, this is a very weird game. Both teams will fumble the ball away as many times as they punt. What's beautiful about this rivalry is whether it's happening in the Superdome or the Georgia Dome, it's guaranteed to play out in a climate-controlled indoor environment. There's no inclement weather or anything else that fouls things up. It's just them. The Cousins trade blows, with Brooks passing for a couple of third-quarter touchdowns to take a 1-point lead. Enter Warrick Dunn. Fans love him, players love him, coaches love him, everyone loves him. Dunn has a reputation as an overwhelmingly kind and decent guy. Earlier in life, he made it through the unspeakable tragedy of his mother, a police officer working a second job as a security guard, being murdered. At the age of 18, he suddenly had to look after his 5 younger brothers and sisters. But the community in Baton Rouge had his back, donating money and pitching in as he somehow kept the strength to keep playing football. It's something he seems to have never forgotten. Throughout his career, he worked with his charity foundation to build homes for struggling families. Even in retirement, when he could easily land a cushy TV job or do anything else he wants to do, he just keeps on giving back and building houses for people. Just a wonderful person. Would you like to see him snap off a 56-yard run? Let's go. Here he is, standing just 5'9" and 180 pounds in the backfield. You've heard this one before. People once thought he was too small to make it as an NFL running back. But sometimes, like this time, it's a good thing. He's small and nimble enough to glide through this entire mess of bodies. If he were any larger, he might not be able to shoot through this canyon. He takes it all the way inside the 20, setting the Falcons up for a field goal that gives them a 2-point lead. With 6 minutes left in the game, the Falcons are clinging to that lead. It's 3rd and 8. Traditionally not at all time for a design quarterback run, but if you study Warrick Dunn, you know that's exactly what this is. He runs downfield to create a lane, not even turning his head, throwing a key block to spring Vic all the way to 6. Now we're falling into the trap here of highlighting Michael Vick's runs without also appreciating his incredible arm, so here you go. He chucks a souvenir all the way up into the second deck that's worth more than a second deck ticket just by virtue of him touching it. But these are Saints fans. Get that shit out of here. Since this is Falcons Saints, a 2-score lead with 6 minutes left is not safe. New Orleans marches right down and kicks a field goal, and right after a disastrous Warrick Dunn fumble, they punch it in to take the lead with 2.5 minutes left. Atlanta has enough time for one last shot, and thanks to a penalty on the kickoff, they're back all the way up to their own 11. short throws to Dunn and Crumpler take him to about midfield, where we can see how his mobility creates options through the air. Rolling left buys him about 3 seconds, an eternity in football time that allows him to throw a dart to the wide open Shawn Jefferson. On the next play, keep an eye on linebacker Charlie Clemens. He's hanging back, serving as what's known as a quarterback spy, keeping his full attention on Vic and trying to discourage him from running. The concept of spying the quarterback has existed since at least the early 80s, but it was pretty obscure until Vic's arrival. Now everyone's talking about it. For what it's worth, Vic would later say he thought it was a bad idea, pointing out that you're pulling off a guy from some other assignment just to babysit him. In other words, if you're leaning, you ain't cleaning. Clemens continues to patiently man his post, but Vic runs anyway, picking up 5 huge yards to help set up a game-winning field goal. Falcons win. Aaron Brooks would square off against Michael Vick 4 more times in his career. He never beat him. But thanks to this win, as well as another over the Saints a few weeks later, Atlanta edged New Orleans for the final wildcard spot. An effective rookie had led the Falcons to the playoffs, and along the way he set a single-game rushing record for a quarterback. It came in Week 13 in Minnesota. About 2 minutes into overtime, Vic has 127 rushing yards, something no quarterback has accomplished in 30 years. Of course, that's before this. It'll later be reported that the original plan here was to throw, but I think he threw that out the window really early. Look at where he's looking. If he were buying time to throw, his eyes would be downfield. Clearly, he sees something. What? I don't know, because there are purple jerseys all up and down the left side of the field. Watching plays like this make you feel like you're watching a rock climber. You don't see the vision. You can't perceive the footholds. But Vic sees every last one. He knows he can turn on the Jets just hard enough to make it through this hole a millisecond before it closes on him. Because he knows these things, he scores a game winner that ultimately gets the Falcons into the postseason. And forget 127. Vic finishes with 173 rushing yards, obliterating the quarterback record. This mark will stand for a decade before Colin Kaepernick finally breaks it. These dots represent all the mobile quarterbacks of the future who will follow in his footsteps. They also represent the achievements of Vic himself, whose single-game performances can also be seen here, and here. It was as though the football gods had set up level bosses for Michael Vick, each with their own poetic ties with Vic and the Falcons. The next would be a fellow superstar, the one the Falcons drafted exactly 10 years prior to Vic, only to let him slip away.
The Falcons get their second playoff crack at their old pal Brett Favre in what is historically the most inhospitable place for postseason visitors, Lambeau Field. There, the Packers have won each of their 11 all-time postseason games by an average of nearly 15 points, including that drubbing they gave June Jones' squad 7 years earlier. Green Bay also went undefeated at home in the regular season, and to further stack the deck against Atlanta, Favre had won each and every one of his 35 starts played in sub-35 degree temperatures, which this one would be. There was also some concern going into it that Vic's play had fallen off of late as he'd become more turnover prone over the last 5 games. But under the bright postseason lights, Vic takes all of one drive to put those questions to bed, with a bullet to Shawn Jefferson giving Atlanta an early 7-point lead. Their special teams would get in on the fun later in the first quarter, with Mark Simoneau snatching the ball right from Packer punter Josh Bidwell's foot that they recovered for a touchdown and a 14-0 lead. Even a punt of their own turns out quite fruitful early in the second quarter when officials ruled that the football bounced off a Packer, with Atlanta recovering the live ball and keeping possession. It did appear the ball hit a Falcon first, but no ensuing challenge means they get to keep possession, which enables the bruising TJ Duckett to carry half the Packers' defense into the end zone as the lead balloons to 21. Finally, the Packers wake up and Favre drives them downfield to set up a 1st and goal on Atlanta's 1-yard line. First down, incompletion out the back of the end zone. Second down, the Falcons stuff star running back Ahman Green. Third down, Brooking breaks up a pass. Fourth down, Green gets blown up by D lineman Ellis Johnson exploding into the backfield. Monumental goal line stand.
On the next possession, Vic marshals the Falcons all the way across the field, and along the way we're treated to my very favorite Michael Vick highlight ever. It's 3rd and 3 at the Packers' 40. Vic rolls left and finds defensive end Kabir Bajabiamila right on top of him. As Packers fans will tell you, this is not just some dude. At 6'4", 250, he outweighs Vic by at least 40 pounds, but he still has explosive speed. In this era, he's recording more quarterback sacks than almost anyone, putting himself in Michael Strahan territory. If all that isn't scary enough, his nickname is KGB, and if that isn't scary enough, he is the only person on planet Earth who likes Ted Cruz. So I don't know what you're dealing with, man, but just look out. Vic gazes downfield, but he doesn't see any options through the air. He also knows he won't be able to find the edge around KGB. He won't step out of bounds because he's Michael Vick. He doesn't have enough space or the right angle to juke him, so what does he do? He fights him. Vic faces up against a much bigger man, and with his one free hand, he grabs him and throws him to the ground. This is jiu-jitsu. Somewhere, I hope, Elio Gracie is smiling. To stun on him even further, he stops, takes a moment to adjust his face mask like he's Indiana Jones fixing his hat, and changes course to sprint right up the gut. Anyone who has a favorite kick returner already knows what's going to happen here. We've been deprived of some of the most spectacular plays in football history because one guy got a finger on one shoelace, and that's what happens here. Look at all the green space ahead. If it weren't for that, Vic was gone. It would have been one of the most incredible touchdowns ever scored. Nearly 20 years later, I'm still stunned. I cannot believe this man.
Vic leads the Falcons to a short field goal to go into the break up 24-zip. And that was pretty much it. At best, the Packers have one tiny sliver of hope, down 20 with the ball in the red zone on 4th down and a little under 8 minutes remaining. That hope gets promptly extinguished as Vic has now become the youngest quarterback to ever win a playoff game, in the process pouring cold water on the famed Lambeau Field mystique. The Falcons can spread their wings and soar all the way to Philadelphia for the divisional round of the playoffs. The Eagles are welcoming back QB Donovan McNabb from a broken ankle 8 weeks earlier, so it would be a quarterback matchup of Syracuse recruiter and recruit. In a defensive slugfest, the Falcons make one crucial mistake early when midway through the first quarter, Philly's pass rush forces Vic to rush a throw off his back foot to Jefferson. Philly corner Bobby Taylor undercuts the route for the pick and turns it into a 7-point mistake. Each team kicks a couple first-half field goals, and the game reaches halftime, with Atlanta still down 7. Near the end of the third quarter, the Falcons have a golden opportunity. They advance deep in Philly territory when Vic drops back before he explodes through a huge hole up the middle and absorbs a ferocious blast from safety Brian Dawkins that knocks his wind out while scoring an apparent game-tying touchdown. But wait just a minute now, there is a reason that cavernous running lane formed. The holding infraction wipes out the touchdown and probably makes that Dawkins hit hurt a whole lot worse, especially when compounded by kicker Jay Feely booting the ensuing short field goal just a bit outside. On the first play of the fourth quarter, the Eagles execute everyone's favorite play, the 4th and manageable punt from inside the enemy 40-yard line. The Falcons, still down just one score, see their two most reliable pass catchers, Crumpler and wideout Brian Finneran, drop back-to-back passes that each would have been enough to move the chains, but instead kill the drive and force a punt back to the Eagles. McNabb leads his team down to Atlanta's 35, where a big 3rd and 1 stop brings up a huge 4th down. Wade Phillips dials up an all-out blitz, but Philly has a good protection called. McNabb's able to get outside the pocket, and he connects with James Thrash, who escapes Ray Buchanan's grasp to stick the dagger in Atlanta's heart. Down 2 touchdowns with a little over 6 minutes left, the Falcons get in position for one on their next drive, but a turnover on downs twists that dagger, closing the book on a memorable run led by their new 22-year-old franchise player.
One of the most thrilling seasons in Falcons history was followed by an overhaul. Vic suffered a broken leg in, of all things, a damn preseason game that didn't even matter. They hoped to have him back in a month's time, but he didn't make his first start until week 14, by which point the Falcons had fallen to 2-10. Vic did his best to turn things around at the end, but it was too late. If nothing else, it demonstrated how crucial Michael Vick was to this football team. A lot of things changed in this time. After decades of ownership by the Smith family, the Falcons were bought by Arthur Blank in 2002. Blank had come to Atlanta by way of the Daily Bugle, having previously managed talented young photographer Peter Parker. Now, in Michael Vick, he managed another young upstart with a similar level of physical talent. The two became very close over the years to come. Look, Blank's a multi-billionaire, which is wrong on its face, and if you have that much money, the ethical thing to do would be to drop 99% of it out of a helicopter and then go live in a cool houseboat somewhere. But it should be said that while NFL teams are often owned by some of the most avaricious scumbags this country has to offer, Blank's foundation has donated hundreds of millions of dollars toward charitable efforts in the Atlanta area. Blank is, as far as owners go, pretty well liked. Being a co-founder of Home Depot, he was surely naturally drawn to a gigantic drafty building with a tall ceiling and bad lighting that smelled kind of weird. It was evident pretty early on that he wasn't solely driven by profit though, and he genuinely cared about the human beings who made up the organization. When Blank found Vic in tears after that broken leg, he cried with him. After stumbling to 3-10 without Vic, Dan Reeves was let go. At close to 7 seasons, his coaching tenure was the longest a Falcon coach had ever had. And of course, he delivered them the miracle 1998 season and Super Bowl appearance that had always seemed a million miles away. But this is the way it always goes. If you're the Falcons head coach, you will be fired. Whether you're Norb Hecker, who was very happy to get it over with, Norm Van Brocklin, who was canned after challenging every reporter in the room to a fistfight, Pat Pepler, who knew he'd be fired the day he was hired, Lehman Bennett, who was too friendly for management's liking, Dan Henning, whose teams lost 9 million football games, Jerry Glanville, whose firing was the most normal thing about him, or June Jones, whose team collapsed after a sideline blow-up. Marion Campbell was the only Falcons coach ever to voluntarily quit, but even he was fired by the team in a previous tenure. So, after 7 years of the relatively normal Dan Reeves, we need to return to the Falcons' time-honored tradition of hiring a coach who's A, a name we already know, and B, a strange person. A coach's son would be perfect in both respects. Tell you what, let's just try this.
Hello. Attention everyone. If I could have your attention for 1 minute, if any of you people have had an oddball child at any point, we would love to offer them a head coaching position. Once again, please come forward if you have a weird son.
The best introduction to the younger Jim Mora is probably the one he gave to Arthur Blank. Though he had a famous last name, Mora was a relative nobody compared to others the Falcons were considering, and he walked into the interview a distant long shot. He won them over by, and I have no idea how this worked, lugging a huge bag full of books in with him. Not a book bag, but like a giant sack of books, like he was the world's worst Elder Scrolls player. Apparently, if he came up with an idea, he'd write it down and throw it in his knowledge sack, and that was his system. "Look at how smart I am," he says. "I have a sack full of books. This is incredible," say the Falcons, who are so positive they've got their man that they turn around and cancel their subsequent interview with, "Oh boy." Moving on. Like his dad, Mora became known for throwing fits on the sideline. Among his weirder habits was huffing ammonia on the sideline during games to keep him on 10. I'm not sure he needed it. Jim Mora was an exceptionally driven person. Nobody had ever wanted to be an NFL coach more than this guy. In the first year, it showed.
Personnel-wise, the most notable addition to the 2004 club came when they invested another top 10 draft pick on a Virginia Tech Hokie with sub-4.4 speed in cornerback D'Angelo Hall, who immediately became the team's most talented defensive back since primetime. Owners of arguably the league's worst pass defense the year before, Hall stabilized their secondary, and Vic rebounded from his derailed 03 season well enough to be the lone reason that Peyton Manning, in arguably the most dominant regular season in NFL history, wasn't a unanimous MVP. With those pieces falling into place, Mora guided Atlanta to 11 wins, good enough to secure the NFC's 2 seed and a first-round bye in the playoffs. But this most certainly wasn't your typical team that earns a week off in January. The majority of their wins were by 4 or fewer points, and they also had some clunkers like their 46-point loss in Kansas City, by far the worst of any team in the entire season, and the worst in 15 years by an eventual playoff team. They ultimately scored just 3 more points than they allowed throughout the regular season, good for 14th in the NFL, and woefully lagging in comparison to other bye-week earners during the 30-year period in which 2 teams per conference received one. But with the sport's ultimate wildcard under center when they welcomed the Rams to town for the divisional round of the playoffs, at the very least, you could count on the Falcons to put on a show in their dome. In Vic's home postseason debut, it takes all of 1 minute until he Houdinis his way out of some pressure, cuts back, and bursts into open space for the whole country to see the total lack of a defensive answer for his one-of-a-kind speed. 2 plays later, he threads the needle with a bullet to Crumpler, and that opens the floodgates. At first, St. Louis is able to bounce back when the Falcons bite on play action and lose track of speedy wide receiver Kevin Curtis, who's able to tie up the game. But the Rams defense has no ability to stop the bleeding on the ground, and that's definitely not just limited to Vic. On Atlanta's second possession, Dunn's 2 carries cover all 75 Falcons scrimmage yards after he gets loose upfield, breaks a tackle, and lets his track star speed carry him the rest of the way to take back the lead. After a defensive stop, Dunn has an even easier time scoring when he's barely touched on his way to the end zone. The Rams respond with quarterback Mark Bulger finding Torrey Holt, who's slipped behind Atlanta's secondary to again make things competitive. But these will be the final fleeting moments where this is a competitive affair. Close to halftime, punt returner Allen Rossum's 68-yard rumble right up the gut knocks the Rams on the ropes, and the Falcons' defense emerging from halftime firing on all cylinders delivers the knockout blow. They pitch a second-half shutout while even chipping in a couple points of their own when defensive end Brady Smith smokes Hall of Fame left tackle Orlando Pace for the end-zone sack. After a resounding playoff victory in which Vic broke the record for most rushing yards by a quarterback in a playoff game, and the team rushed for the 3rd most yards in any playoff game since the merger, the Falcons are once again set to hit the road for the city of brotherly love. This time, their date with the Eagles will be for a trip to Jacksonville and Super Bowl 39. In brutal sub-zero temperatures, the dome team from the south shockingly comes out flat. Mora's early decision to punt from Philly's 37-yard line
and the wind throws it backward.
Flips the field by a whole 7 yards. Then their ability to wrap up, but inability to take down Eagles running back Dorsey Levens proves costly. Almost as costly as the Falcons having a 1st and goal from the 2 and ultimately kicking a field goal on their ensuing possession. Things look bleak when McNabb hits tight end Chad Lewis in the corner of the end zone for the 14-3 lead, only for the Falcons offense to finally show some life when Dunn scampers in for a 10-yard touchdown to make it just a 4-point game at the half. But in a weird bit of bizarro symmetry, a week after Atlanta's defense allowed 0 second-half points, their offense scores 0 second-half points. Once again, Eagles defensive coordinator Jim Johnson had Vic and the Falcons offense completely stymied. Generally an extremely heavy blitzer, Johnson resisted that tactic against Vic, with the luxury of being able to rely on his front 4 to create havoc while keeping Vic contained in the pocket in a bitter 27-10 loss.
You know what? We're now entering year number 40 of the Atlanta Falcons experiment, and we've never seen this team post winning records in even 2 consecutive seasons. Hasn't happened once. Every single winning season has been isolated. That's not really an issue of continuity either. The winning teams typically stay intact the following season, but for one reason or another, or maybe for no good reason at all, it just dips. Jim Mora, whose 2005 squad started 6-2, seemed destined to finally end this weird anomaly until their record turned perfectly inside out, landing them at 8-8. But that's what next year's are for.
13 games into the 2006 season, the Falcons were 7-6 and tied with the Giants and Eagles in a scrum for the 2 wildcard spots. And, sparked by that NFC Championship appearance in year 1, Mora was less than 9 months removed from landing a lucrative contract extension. Now he was closing in on his second playoff berth in 3 seasons as Falcons head coach. Everything seemed to be going just dandy. That's when Mora decided to go on the radio. In mid-December, Mora conducted an interview with a Seattle radio station in which one of the hosts was his good buddy and former college roommate at the University of Washington, Hugh Millen. As the interview wound down, the idea of Mora becoming the head coach at his alma mater was broached. Now, if an angel and a devil were supposed to pop up on each shoulder in that moment to give him advice on how to handle those musings, then the angel was apparently just stuck in that Atlanta traffic. Mora cannonballed into his enthusiastic response like he was Kevin McAllister at the Plaza Hotel swimming pool. After acknowledging that the job wasn't even, vacant, Mora could not contain himself from gushing over just how badly he wanted that gig. He was even thrown a life raft when he was all teed up for a chance to say that would only be the case if he were available. He refused that life raft. Then he doubled down by saying it could even be right smack in the middle of a playoff run, and he'd still up and bail. And as the coup de grace, he undermined future Jim's ability to later claim he was kidding. Which, of course, in his mea culpa, is exactly what he had to do. Now, UW is my alma mater too. I get it, it's a wonderful place. But Jim, you are currently an NFL head coach in the middle of an NFL season. It is 2 days before a huge primetime game against the Cowboys, and you are in the thick of the playoff picture while ostensibly possessing plenty of job security in the wake of that extension. And you still can't stop going on and on, fantasizing about another job that, again, still has its seat filled. What in the hell are you thinking? The damage was done. No putting the toothpaste back in that tube. The Falcons would go on to drop each of their final 3 games, miss the playoffs, and the day after the season ended, Mora was fired. Sure, his goose was all but cooked with the radio segment, but the passing stagnation of Vic was another key element of Mora's demise. He'd brought Greg Knapp along with him from San Francisco as his offensive coordinator, and he wasn't really the right choice to nurture a talent like Vic's. The two often clashed, and Vic never felt comfortable in Knapp's system. I've never seen a coach make the fourth quarter completely irrelevant quite like Mora. In 26 of his 48 regular season games, the Falcons were tied or winning after 45 minutes. And they won all but one of them, with their winning percentage on such games higher than everyone in that time but the Patriots. In the 22 games that they trailed entering the final quarter, however, they lost all but one, as they were one of just 4 teams with such a winning percentage south of 5. Combined with broadcasting his dream to go back to the Great Pacific Northwest, it was clearly time for a new hire and a fresh start in 2007 to make ancient history this ridiculous notion of their head coach openly flirting with bailing for a college gig in the middle of a season.
Whoever the Falcons chose as their next head coach would need to understand how to make the most of Michael Vick and draw up an offensive game plan that would take him to a higher gear. Jim Mora had had a defensive coordinator's background, an offensive coordinator who drew up an unimpressive game plan for Vick, and a father who called Vick a coach killer. Man, the Moras just love saying stuff. Anyway, a lot of pundits were starting to doubt Vic around this time, with many insisting that he'd never improve as a passer. To their credit, Vic wasn't pushing himself quite as much as he could have. He'd later say that although he was putting in tons of work, he got comfortable. He figured he'd get closer to his 30th birthday and then worry about his potential. Who among us, right? Vic was an exceptionally smart quarterback with staggering arm talent, but it just wasn't showing up in the numbers. In his first 5 years as a starter, his passer rating lingered in the high 70s, territory that was not at all exceptional. The fact remained, though, that he was making history on foot. In 2006, Michael Vick became the first quarterback ever to rush for 1,000 yards in a single season. In modern times, only 1990 Randall Cunningham has even come close, but even then, Cunningham's achievement was isolated, and since his line allowed tons of sacks, he was often just fleeing in terror. Vick was the first quarterback to demonstrate an ability not only to utilize his running as a weapon, but do this with consistency. And that's how he changed history and influenced the future of American football. His performances in those years started to change how a lot of coaches, particularly high school coaches, perceived quarterback development, and it influenced what those young quarterbacks themselves felt they were capable of. If a quarterback was, say, 14 years old while watching Vick's masterclasses in 2006, he'd be 24 years old in 2016. And here they were, right on time. It's no longer the least bit unusual to see a quarterback rush for 500 yards in a season. There's only one, though, who has been able to surpass what Vick did, his heir apparent, Lamar Jackson, who somehow rushed for 1,200 yards in 2019. Jackson is far from Vick's shadow. He's clearly his own player, but he didn't come up with that style of play on his own. Jackson would have been 9 years old at the peak of Vick's rushing abilities. You know what 9-year-olds love? Video games. And when a young Lamar Jackson fired up a game of Madden, he religiously played as Michael Vick every single time.
Sports fans and broadcasters alike would often see Vick and describe it as video game-like. However, in the case of Michael Vick, that's not 100% true, because the video game versions of him were somewhat even more dominant. Across most football video games, you can argue that playing as a dual-threat quarterback is the most fun experience, in part because it reminds us of running around in the backyard trying to escape the other kid that just finished counting to 3 Mississippi. Michael Vick was the perfect conductor in the orchestra of football chaos. Michael Vick's first Madden appearance was in 2002 as a 72 overall. Even though Chris Chandler was the real-life starting quarterback for a majority of that season, Vick's rating was already higher than Chandler's, who was a nice 69 overall. While Vick's 72 rating might seem pedestrian, I'm sure many people saw what he did in college and played as him, or simply adjusted his stats and attributes. Even if you left his ratings as is, Vick was still fun to play. When you combine his 89 speed in Madden as the ball carrier with those quick-cutting jukes and a spin move that allows you to teleport 5 yards, you get someone that's very hard to tackle. Madden 2003 was a slight improvement as Vick was given a 78 overall, but the next year, everything changed. Madden 2004 was when video game Vick became a name everyone feared. Even EA Sports themselves recognizes Michael Vick by himself as one of the top 25 features in Madden history. Not players, features. Vick is the only player on that list. His overall rating shot from a 78 to a 95. His speed was a 95 overall, which was higher than all but 4 running backs in the game. His throwing was off the charts, but that's not the end of it. Madden 2004 was the first game to introduce playmaker controls. This was a game maker mechanic that changed everything. You could flip plays and adjust routes with ease before the snap, sure, but the wild shit happened after the snap. Playmaker control allowed you to adjust the instructions for a receiver mid-route, mid-play. This means that you could control Michael Vick and the receiver closest to him to either create space or get a receiver open. In addition to that, you could also create your own plays and formations in Madden 2003 and 2004, which allowed you to make the craziest formations and plays that you've ever seen. Now, this seems like a fun little harmless feature in theory, but when you give this feature to video game Vick, defensive AI stood no chance. I mean, what the hell do you even do against this? In theory, you could have someone come over to your house and you could choose the Falcons and a playbook that you created that your friend in the defensive AI could do nothing about. Michael Vick was so good in Madden that the next 2 Maddens had features that served as indirect nerfs to Vick. For those that don't know, a nerf is when something is tweaked to make something weaker or less dangerous, much like how a nerf football to the face isn't as painful as an actual football to the face. Madden 2005's campaign and marketing focused entirely on the defensive side of the ball. Ray Lewis was on the cover. The trailer even has him tackling Michael Vick in a way to let you know that you weren't getting the same game as last year. The AI was smarter. They added defensive hot routes and the hit stick to give you some options to stop Vick. Now don't get me wrong, Vick was still a freaking 92 overall and fast as hell, but at least there were some things in place now. The The developers learned from how dominant Vic was and made the proper adjustments to make sure no one else dominated the game like that again. Now, Vic wasn't the highest overall player in Madden 2004. Hell, he wasn't even the highest rated quarterback in the game, but no one wanted to play as Brett Favre. 99 overalls have graced Madden both before and after Vic, but no one will ever be as unfair on the virtual football fields as the red number 7.
The real Vic was just as electrifying. If he could supplement his rushing ability with the top-tier passing ability we all knew he had in him, he could blow the entire sport wide open. He could become the damn Terminator. He could lead the Atlanta Falcons to a Super Bowl championship that was long overdue. Forget just one, this team could become a dynasty. All that was missing, it seemed, was an offensive wunderkind. A proven genius who could design everything around Michael Vick. And they found him. As someone who grew up in both Atlanta and Louisville, I am uniquely qualified to assess Bobby Petrino as both a coach and a human being. My verdict is as follows. He is awesome. He is the coolest. Every other football fan in both Louisville and Atlanta agrees with me. We all love him and we want to be just like him and we all think he's great. Okay, this has been a whole lot to throw at you, so at this point in the call I can go ahead and unmute in case anybody has any questions or comments. Well, we got a quiet bunch today. That's okay. That's alright. Let's continue. Petrino had earned a nationwide reputation as an offensive genius, having turned a historically mediocre Louisville football program into a powerhouse that seriously contended for the national title. This made him arguably the most sought-after football coach in America. When other teams called, he couldn't help but listen. In 2003, while at Louisville, he secretly met with Auburn to discuss possibly becoming their head coach and yanking the job away from his own friend Tommy Tuberville behind his back. But the next year he signed a new contract at Louisville, declaring that this is where he wanted to be for good. And if, for example, the LSU job were to open up, there's no way he would interview for it. 5 days later, he interviewed for the LSU job. Everyone got mad at him, he said he was sorry, and finally in 2006, he signed a mammoth $25 million deal to lock him down in Louisville for the next decade. Petrino stuck around 6 months, which is close enough, and then bolted to the Atlanta Falcons without thanking the fans or telling his assistants. It was heralded as a huge coup for Atlanta. Finally, they had a coach with an offensive intellect worthy of Michael Vick's ability. Some might have worried about his track record of disloyalty, but hey, listen, Falcons coaches don't quit. They get fired, but they don't quit. This is the part of the story that everyone knows. In August of 2007, Michael Vick pled guilty to federal dogfighting charges. He was sentenced to prison shortly thereafter, and never played for the Atlanta Falcons again.
It's a crime that will follow Mike Vick for the rest of his life, and something that some people will never quite be able to forgive him for. And I totally get that. It's an inexcusable act that eventually tarnished Vick's legacy on the field, and how people view him as a person. But take a moment to understand Vick's upbringing. Dogfighting is something that he's been exposed to his whole life in Virginia. Yeah, you can say, well, why wouldn't he just change the people he surrounds himself with? Which is something that's a lot easier said than done, when the very same people held him down through thick and thin his entire life. Newport News, Virginia was his home. It was his family. And sometimes it's just hard to turn your back on family. As Falcons fans, we welcomed Vick into our homes every Sunday, so it was tough to immediately turn our back on him as well. Sports can really blind your perception of people because you see them as these heroes who could do no wrong. We were shocked and confused. What Vick did was absolutely wrong. But why do we publicly continue to deem him as a monster when he's paid his debt to society and asked for forgiveness? In prison, Vick dreamed of coming back to the Falcons to be the quarterback that brought the franchise their first Super Bowl win. He still thought it was his team, and fans were more than ready to welcome that idea. I personally know people who held out on the hope that maybe one day, no matter how long it took, Vick would suit up again for the Falcons and make everything right. You can look in the stands of the Georgia Dome and see the majority of the crowd still rocking Vick jerseys. Even his teammates were ready for him to be back, loudly showing their support during games with messages like "Free Mike Vick" on t-shirts. But in the real world, we knew that never would be possible.
Nearly 15 years later, America can't agree on Michael Vick. There are many, such as myself, who believe that the 21 months he spent in federal prison were more than plenty. It's so commonplace in America to lock a human being in a dungeon, and said human beings are almost always so silent and invisible that we've grown completely numb to just how traumatic and tortuous it is. Your sense of self erodes. You feel forgotten, like you've been jettisoned off the planet, far from anyone who loves you. Vick would later describe a day in which his entire universe revolved around a visit with his family. Because of some arbitrary reason that had nothing to do with him, the visit was abruptly canceled. He was so lonely and desperate that it broke him, and he collapsed into tears. Of this feeling, he says, it's like being dead.
Vick was more than just a football player in Atlanta. He was a beacon of hope that made people in the city want to believe again. But that hope came crashing down with the damage that Vick caused. And as a fan base, we had to move on.
Vick saw his own childhood exposure to dogfighting as so consequential and harmful that he helped introduce legislation making it illegal to bring a child to a dogfight. That was just part of his big ongoing project to advocate for animal rights, an effort he continues to this day. In the end, Michael Vick tests our willingness to forgive, and just because I forgive him doesn't mean you have to. Forgiveness is something that can be asked for but not expected. I suppose there's just one thing I would ask you to consider. In prison, Michael Vick paid a price unlike anything most of us have ever paid. He showed unconditional remorse, and he's worked relentlessly to try to make things right however he can. How many others have done things far, far worse without seeing any consequences? We don't need to look elsewhere in time. In fact, it's best that we keep it right here, right in this period of history. These are people I don't need to name. People who destroyed entire worlds and ways of life, decimated the quality of life of untold millions. If this man is the target of your outrage, and not them, I guarantee you've got the wrong guy. Dwelling on all of this felt terrible. I went to the doctor and I said, "Please help me. These events have left me feeling down." The doctor told me, "Laughter is the best medicine. Go see Petrino the Clown. He'll cheer you up. He's exquisitely funny and he will cure all that ails you." And after hesitating for a moment, I said, "That's a fucking great idea." We now return to the adventures of noted, cool, and well-respected guy Bobby Petrino, who now finds himself without the superstar quarterback who was the primary reason he was hired in the first place. Fortunately, Vick's backup over the last couple of years was Matt Schaub, who would go on to have a terrific NFL career. Unfortunately, in what they thought at the time would be their biggest move of the offseason, they'd already traded Schaub. What this offensive wizard was instead left with was a platoon of draft bust Joey Harrington in his final season, Byron Leftwich, a pretty solid quarterback who nonetheless played badly in Atlanta, and career backup Chris Redman. The Falcons fell to 4-12 that season. Arthur Blank, certainly aware of Petrino's history of talking to strangers, got word that Arkansas had been sniffing around and immediately slammed the door shut, sending back word that the Falcons would absolutely not allow them to talk to Petrino. Blank then got to work plotting out the future with Petrino, addressing whatever concerns he had, and generally making sure he was happy as the Falcons coach. Petrino looked him in the eye, shook his hand, and assured that he was in it for the long haul. Problem solved. For about 24 hours. Then Petrino resigned as head coach, immediately fled Atlanta, and signed a deal with Arkansas. And let me tell you, I would have bought a pay-per-view event that was nothing but Falcons players talking shit about him. I'm sure they said a lot of things that couldn't make it into print, but among the highlights of those that did, they called him a quitter and a coward. And if you get that from Warwick Dunn, you've messed up bad. Defensive back Lawyer Malloy said, "This league is for real men." I think he realized he didn't belong here. Part of it was that he left, part of it was how he left. Too chicken shit to actually look his players in the eye or even give them a phone call, Petrino left little laminated notes in their lockers with identical short boilerplate text on each one. Within, Petrino expressed that he wanted to finish the season, but that, quote, circumstances did not allow him to do so. He framed his cowardice, perhaps correctly, as an inevitable force of nature that could not be deterred, as though he was talking about rain canceling a picnic. "Yeah, sorry guys, I wanted to stick around, but unfortunately I'm a total dipshit, and as we all know, nothing can be done about that." The rest of Bobby Petrino's story doesn't concern the Falcons, but it's really cathartic for Falcons fans, so let's just continue. After 4 years, Petrino was building Arkansas into a powerhouse, just as he had at Louisville when he wrecked his motorcycle. What followed was the legendary neck brace press conference, in which he was asked whether anyone was with him at the time of the accident.
Was anybody with you at the site?
When I came out of a ditch, there was a lady there.
That lady was, in fact, on the bike with him. She was an Arkansas football employee, she'd allegedly been shown favoritism by Petrino, and he'd been having an extramarital affair with her. After days of lying about it, he was fired. Incredibly, a couple years later, he somehow got the head coaching job at Louisville again, despite having broken contract and bailed on him years prior. In an unbelievable failure of karma to do its job, he gets to coach Lamar Jackson, who evolves into one of the greatest players in college football history. Michael Vick himself says that Lamar Jackson is like him, only even better. Lamar then leaves for the pros, and without him, Petrino is completely exposed, overseeing one of the most dramatic single-season collapses college football has ever seen, with the Cardinals falling all the way to 2-10. Before the season's over, the University of Louisville and Wave 3 TV give us a moment of true television magic. The news of Bobby Petrino's firing crawls across the bottom of the screen, right in the middle of Bobby Petrino's talk show. Who, I ask you, has ever been more of a flesh and blood realization of Mo Sizlak? A guy who burns every bridge anyone ever built him, whose considerable talents as a football genius are eclipsed by his reputation as the most infamous two-faced liar football has ever seen. Bobby Petrino is America's dunk tank clown, and in this way he's indispensable. He's a guy you can feel good laughing at, because he 100% signed up for every last bit of it. I'm not joking. I genuinely love Bobby Petrino. I appreciate all he's given us, and I hope he's out there somewhere having a good one. The peregrine falcon is the fastest animal of any kind on Earth. When it dives at terminal velocity, it hurtles toward the Earth at nearly 200 miles per hour. In the end, it's not really anatomy that powers the fastest creature in the known universe. It's gravity. The Atlanta Falcons dive at rates that are similarly breathtaking. There was the nosedive of the 80s that felt like it would never end, and put them so deep in the red that they might never dig out. In the 90s, they went to the playoffs, then immediately lost 8 straight in the afterglow of the Glanville years. And their descent right after Super Bowl 33 almost perfectly mirrored the ascent that got them there. Now, the era that appeared to have the most promise was over, instantly, and without warning. Work done, and Algie Crumpler left after the 07 season. Their coach had bailed, the one who was supposed to save the franchise was gone. The identity of the team had vanished, but maybe, in preparation for the exhilarating, confounding final acts, it had to.